The Room. In Vacancy, a couple in crisis realizes too late that they've become the next movie in a murder scheme inside an isolated motel. David and Amy already start the story worn down, dealing with the loss of their child and a broken relationship. During a trip, their car breaks down and they're forced to stop at a motel in the middle of nowhere, run by a very strange manager. Trapped in the room with no signal and that uncomfortable silence, David finds some VHS tapes and decides to watch them. At first, it just seems random, kind of weird, but nothing very clear. But the situation changes quickly. They realize it's not staged. They're real murder. And the detail that makes everything worse is that the recordings happened in that exact room. That moment completely changes the movie. The danger stops being a suspicion and becomes a certainty. The couple realizes that the people behind the recordings are the manager himself and others at the place, who use the motel as a setting to record and sell these crimes. And worse, they're already being prepared as the next victims. Director Nimrod Antal avoided exaggerating the violence and focused more on tension and the suffocating atmosphere. Even with criticism about the cliché-filled script, this tape twist is what makes a lot of people remember the movie to this day. The doll. In The Boy, a babysitter takes what seems like a simple job, taking care of a child in an isolated mansion. There's just one detail. The child is a porcelain doll. Greta arrives at the place thinking everything is strange, but decides to follow the rules set by the homeowners, who treat the doll as if it were a real son. That includes eating at specific times, putting it to bed, reading stories, everything very seriously. At first, it just seems like rich people being weird, but the atmosphere changes when strange things start happening. Objects move, the doll appears in different places, and Greta starts to think there might be something supernatural there. The movie follows exactly that path, full of cliches that a lot of people criticized at the time, but the twist changes everything. There's nothing paranormal. The doll was never alive, but the real Brahms is there the whole time. An adult man, mentally disturbed, who survived a fire in childhood and was hidden by his own parents inside the house. He lives in the walls, watching everything through secret passages and manipulating the environment to maintain the illusion. When Greta finds out, he appears wearing a mask, just like the doll, revealing that everything was his doing. This shift from supernatural to something more real is what made the movie stand out and even secure a sequel a few years later. An unexpected return. Marketed as the big finale of the franchise, in Saw 3D the promise was to end everything with a bang. But what many people saw was a somewhat lost chapter, full of exaggerations and questionable decisions. The story revolves around Bobby Dagan, a guy who became famous for claiming he survived a jigsaw trap, but it's all a lie. Meanwhile, Detective Hoffman continues Jigsaw's legacy, taking the games to an even more chaotic level. The problem is that the movie trades much of the psychological tension of the previous ones for scenes clearly made to take advantage of 3D, with objects flying toward the screen all the time. That, combined with a cleaner aesthetic and odd-looking blood, made a lot of people turn their noses up. Still, in the middle of this chaos comes the twist that really stands out. At the end, when it seems like Hoffman is completely out of control after killing Jill Tuck, someone unexpected shows up. Dr. Lawrence Gordon, the same one from the first movie. And here comes the twist. He not only survived, but had been helping Jigsaw the whole time after the first film, working behind the scenes, using his medical knowledge to keep the games going even after John Kramer's death. The final scene closes a cycle directly with the beginning of the franchise. Gordon captures Hoffman and takes him back to the iconic bathroom from the first movie, leaving him trapped there, repeating the fate he himself helped create. This idea of Gordon as an accomplice had been circulating among fans for years, which made many feel like the movie just confirmed a popular theory instead of building something new.
Game over.
The Mysterious Book. In the number 23, an ordinary man discovers that his own mind may be hiding a crime he committed himself. Walter Sparrow, played by Jim Carrey, lives a quiet life until he receives a strange book as a gift called Number 23. From that point on, everything starts to fall apart. The story in the book follows a character obsessed with the number 23, seeing patterns in absolutely everything, and Walter realizes the events described there are strangely connected to his life. At first, it just seems like coincidence, but the obsession grows quickly. Dates, names, situations, everything leads to the number 23, and the more he tries to ignore it, the more the pattern appears. This is the point where the movie hooks you because this paranoia becomes increasingly uncomfortable. A lot of people thought the movie was over the top, even confusing, but this mental spiral is exactly what holds everything together. The twist comes when the truth starts to surface. The book isn't about someone else, it's about him.
You wrote the book, Walter.
Walter discovers that before his current life, he was a man named Fingerling, completely consumed by this same obsession. In a breakdown, he committed a murder out of jealousy, and after that, tried to take his own life. He survived, but lost his memory, creating a new identity and forgetting everything. The book was a confession written by himself before all of that. In other words, his mind had been trying to make him remember the whole time. The Collector. In Ghost Ship, a marine salvage crew thinks they've found an easy reward, but actually walks straight into a macabre soul-collecting game. It all starts when the crew of the Arctic Warrior is approached by a mysterious man who talks about a missing ship full of gold. Easy money, right? They head to the legendary Antonia Graza, an ocean liner lost for decades. And yes, this is the same ship from that famous opening scene, the one pretty much everyone agrees is better than the rest of the movie. When they board the ship, the atmosphere is already strange. Total silence, signs of abandonment, and some apparitions that make it clear this isn't just an empty ship. Little by little, things start going wrong, the team splits up, bad decisions are made. That classic package that got the movie criticized at the time for being full of cliches and cheap scares. But the twist comes at the end. The man who pointed them to the ship, Jack Ferriman, is not who he seems. He was never a survivor or just some random guy. In fact, he's an entity that manipulates people through greed. His plan is simple and cruel. Lure groups to the ship, make them destroy themselves, and then collect their souls. The protagonist Epps manages to react and blows up the ship, apparently ending everything. But the movie doesn't end there. In the final scene, Ferriman shows up again, unharmed, carrying the gold to another ship full of people. Even with heavy criticism of the script, this soul collector idea is what helped the movie gain cult status over time. The Beach. In 2021, M. Night Shyamalan brought us Old, a movie that tells the story of Guy and Priska, who are on vacation with their kids, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy even as their marriage falls apart. Everything seems calm until they're invited to a secluded beach. When they get there, things slowly start to change. A body appears, people start getting sick, and then comes the most absurd detail. The kids begin to age within hours. Time moves differently there, very differently. Every half hour represents years of life and no one can leave. Every attempt to escape ends in fainting or something worse. The idea is very good, but the awkward dialogue and some performances ended up taking away part of the impact. Still, the tension of watching characters age rapidly, dealing with diseases appearing out of nowhere, and desperate decisions keeps everything working. The twist comes when the truth is revealed. It's not a natural phenomenon, but the entire resort is a front for a pharmaceutical company that uses guests as test subjects. Each person there was chosen for having a specific condition, and the drugs are tested on that beach because the effects of an entire lifetime can be observed in just a few hours. In the end, only the children survived, but now they're already adults, and they managed to expose everything. To be honest, this final plot doesn't make the movie better, but we have to admit that the idea of a beach where you age in just a few hours and all the mysteries that come with it is pretty interesting to watch. The Human Doll. In Dead Silence, Jamie returns to his hometown after his wife dies, mysteriously right after receiving a strange doll in the mail. Without understanding what happened, he starts investigating and discovers the legend of Mary Shaw, a former ventriloquist who was supposedly murdered and now haunts the area. The rule tied to her is simple. If you see Mary Shaw, you can't scream. And of course, that's never as easy as it sounds. The movie follows that classic investigation path, with Jamie trying to connect the dots while strange things keep happening. At the time, many people criticized exactly that, saying the story was predictable and the characters didn't help much. The big twist happens when Jamie returns to his father's house and realizes something is completely wrong. The man he thought was alive has actually been dead for a long time, and the figure living beside him, acting normally as his stepmother, is not a regular person. She is in fact a creation of Mary Shaw, a kind of human doll controlled by the entity, part of a larger plan for revenge against the Ashen family. When Jamie realizes this, he's already completely trapped in the situation, and it's too late. The movie was directed by James Wan, and even though it was criticized at release, it ended up gaining cult status years later. The Hidden Twin. In Malignant, the protagonist Madison starts having visions of brutal murder, but they're not just visions. Everything she sees is actually happening in real time. At first, it feels like that classic supernatural horror, with a mysterious entity chasing and killing people connected to her past. And that's where the split begins. A lot of people bought into the idea, while others thought it was all a bit too over the top and even strange. Also directed by James Wan, the movie escalates quickly. Madison realizes there's a figure named Gabriel behind the crimes, and that this presence has a direct connection to her childhood. But the more the story moves forward, the more things drift away from the serious horror tone and enter almost absurd territory. That's exactly where the movie gains fans and loses others. The twist comes when we find out that Gabriel isn't a spirit or an external invader. He was always there, literally. Madison had a parasitic twin as a child, a being with human traits that grew attached to her body. The doctors removed as much as possible, but couldn't fully separate their brains, so they sealed Gabriel inside her. After a trauma, he awakens and starts taking control of her body. And here the movie goes completely off the rails. Her body twists in bizarre ways, plays while Gabriel acts, attacking the victims. The more exaggerated style was intentional and explains why the movie became such a love it or hate it phenomenon among audiences. The Fake Child. Orphan tells the story of a couple who decide to adopt a child after a recent loss and believe they've found the perfect daughter, until they realize something is very wrong with her. At first, everything seems normal, but small behaviors start raising suspicion. Esther doesn't fit in. She's too mature, speaks in a strange way, and reacts coldly in situations that don't make sense for a child. Kate notices at first, but no one takes her seriously. Her husband thinks it's just paranoia, while things keep escalating in increasingly uncomfortable ways. This sense of doubt is what carries much of the movie, and it was one of the aspects that divided critics at the time, even though audiences were more on board. The twist comes in the third act, and that's where the movie earns its cult status. Esther isn't a child, but an adult woman named Lena Klammer, who has a rare condition that makes her body look childlike. And that's not even the worst part. She's done this before. She infiltrates families, builds trust, manipulates everyone, and when things get out of control, eliminates anyone in her way, including trying to take the mother's place within the family. Actress Isabel Fuhrman was only 12 during filming, which makes her performance even more impressive and disturbing. One of the main reasons the movie is still remembered today. The Deal. In the 6th movie of the franchise, Hellraiser, Hellseeker, Trevor survives a car crash that supposedly killed his wife, Kirsty, and from that point on, reality starts to fall apart. He wakes up confused with memory gaps and a constant feeling that something is wrong. People appear and disappear, situations don't make sense, and the presence of the Cenobites starts to show up little by little, as if everything is connected to something bigger. The film follows this more investigative style, almost like a psychological thriller, which already divided a lot of people. Some found it interesting, others just saw a confusing and slow script. And to make things worse, the marketing promised the return of Kirsty, the classic protagonist from the first movies. But she barely appears for most of the story, which frustrated many fans. But everything changes at the end. The truth is much more straightforward than it seems. Trevor isn't the victim of the story. He's responsible for everything. He betrayed Kirsty and planned to kill her along with his lovers to get her money.
I trusted you. I trusted you, God.
But the plan went wrong. Kirsty found out everything and made a deal with Pinhead. In exchange for her own survival, she would deliver the souls of those involved in the plan. And Trevor was one of them. The big reveal is that all that confusion he's experiencing isn't real. He already died in the crash. Everything he's going through is actually his punishment, a kind of mental torture in hell. The movie wasn't originally a Hellraiser script, it was adapted later, which explains why it feels different and somewhat out of place within the franchise. The Simulation. 5 American soldiers are sent to protect a castle in France during World War II. That's the premise of Ghosts of War. The mission seems simple, but the place already has a reputation for being haunted. At first, the movie follows that basic haunted house horror, with strange noises, moving objects, and invisible presence that slowly makes things more intense. But as events become more extreme, the soldiers start to realize they're not dealing with just a typical supernatural force. The visions become more personal, more connected to them, as if the ghost knows exactly where to hit each one. And then comes the twist that completely divided audiences. None of that is actually happening in World War II. In reality, they are modern soldiers, injured in combat in Afghanistan. The entire castle setting is a simulation created to treat their psychological trauma. The most disturbing part is that the ghosts aren't random. They represent a family that died in a real mission these soldiers failed to save. In other words, the haunting is actually guilt turned into a nightmare. In the end, even knowing the truth, the protagonist chooses to return to the simulation, trying to face it again. Even though the plot twist was widely praised, many people didn't like this sudden shift, because the movie abandons classic supernatural horror and turns into more of a psychological sci-fi in the final act. The Final Flight. Final Destination 5 follows that classic franchise pattern. A premonition saves a group of people from a tragedy, and then death starts to correct that one by one. Sam has a vision of a suspension bridge collapsing, manages to save some co-workers, and from there, the game begins. Up to this point, nothing very different from what we've already seen. And that's exactly why many people criticized it at the time, feeling the formula was already worn out. Throughout the story, a new idea appears. It's possible to cheat death if someone takes another person's place. This creates the feeling that maybe this time, someone might actually escape, and the movie builds that hope all the way to the end. But then comes the twist. After everything, Sam and Molly believe they've finally broken the cycle and decide to travel to start over. They board a plane to Paris and soon notice some chaos happening. A passenger panics, saying the plane is going to explode, and ends up being forcibly removed. At that moment, everything clicks. It's not just any flight, it's Flight 180, the same one from the first movie. In other words, the entire story actually takes place before Final Destination. What seemed like a sequel was actually a hidden prequel. Simply genius. And of course, there's no escape. The plane explodes and everyone dies. And if you want to see how the most famous deaths in Premonition movies were made, click on the screen and watch. See you there.